First of all, I want to express my really deep appreciation. I'm not going to start naming names because then I'll forget somebody and they'll be deeply insulted. I don't want to start out with an insult. I want to thank the RSIS and everybody who's been involved in making not only an invitation to me and my younger colleague enjoyable, but wow, what a turnout. I'm sure you're all brilliant intellectuals, so this is going to be great fun. So let me begin with that word of thanks. I'm going to try to keep to the time that I was told, but if I'm really bad, I can depend on you to give me the sign that, right, okay. All right. And because I wanted to be as clear as possible, I'm going to basically read my presentation. If this were somewhat shorter and less formal, I would just do it from the heart. But you're going to get more of the head in this way. So first of all, our first existence was in our mother's womb, nourished through the umbilical cord. We had the sensation of an all-embracing oneness. Then we were born, thrust out into that strange stuff that we call air. It was a profound shock, and so we did what all babies do. We cried. But then we soon again were embraced by a sort of oneness when we felt our mother's comforting breast exuding sweet milk. Like all babies, we wanted to embrace whatever we encountered. We wanted to become one with it, putting everything in our mouths into us. Thus, from our very beginning, we humans want to include everything we encounter, to become one with it. We strive to expand ourselves, to embrace all that we encounter. Hence, the subtitle of my reflections with you today, namely, we humans are by our nature inclusive and expansive. Our common English language assists us in grasping this profound truth in ways of which we may not all be aware. For example, by noting that we humans by nature are inclusive. We literally are saying that when we say that we are born. Nativity, natus in Latin, and that means nature, by our nature. There are almost endless ramifications of this fundamental truth of our expansive, inclusive human nature. I intend to explore several of them together with you, asking, among other questions, how this expansive, inclusive force works to our individual and communal welfare if we would but embrace our womb and birthing instincts. This fundamental truth too often is something we forget at our peril. However, fortunately for us, the wise ones in our human community have enshrined it for us in our communal human history, especially in the Golden Rule, which was articulated across multiple civilizations from China to Europe and all in between. It was done in that global formative period that we have come to refer to as the axial period, 800-200 BCE. And broad as these ancient civilizations were, however, they still tended to be restricted to their geographical areas. However, today, we no longer live in such relative isolation, no matter how large. We, in fact, today live in a burgeoning global world. With modern technical developments like television, the smartphone, and others, we live in each other's living rooms, and each can be in direct contact with each other the world over. Here I'm sitting halfway across the world from where I came just a couple of days ago. We must overcome the fear which is engendered by our encountering the strange, the foreign. We too easily fall back to our second birth experience of the strange, that strange thing, the air, and then we cry out. We need to embrace our even more fundamental nature, the way we were conceived in our mother's womb and then born, natus, nature, which is expansive, inclusive. David Brooks wrote in the New York Times recently, quote, "People are wired to cooperate. Far from being a flimsy thing, the desire for cooperation is the primary human evolutionary advantage we have over the other animals." Brooks went on to note that humans, quote, "have a set of universal intuitions that help establish harmony between peoples. And from their first moments, children are wired to feel each other's pain. You don't have to teach a child about what fairness is. They already know. There is no society on earth where people are admired for running away in battle or lying to their friends. People have a moral sense, unquote. Brooks pointed out that we humans, quote again, are attracted by goodness and repelled by selfishness, and recalled a beautiful example given to him by New York University social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who studied the effervescent feelings of joy we spontaneously have when we see someone acting selflessly. Haidt wrote of a friend who once observed a man who was driving along and saw an elderly lady shoveling the snow in her drive, and spontaneously jumped out of his car and helped her shovel the snow. The friend wrote that when he saw that gratuitous act of generosity, quote, "I felt like jumping out of the car and hugging this guy. I felt like singing and running or skipping and laughing, just being active. I felt like saying nice things about people, writing a beautiful poem or love song, playing in the snow like a child, telling everybody about his deed." There is, however, much more than just our common experience pointing to our human tendency to reach out to others, to expand our egos, as most recently pointed out by Mitch Prinstein, professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of North Carolina. He said, quote, "Popular people live longer." And his book titled, "Popular, the Power of Likability in a Status-Obsessed World," unquote. He reported that Professor Julianne Holt-Lunstad from Brigham Young University conducted a study of 308,000 participants between the ages of 6 and 92. That's even older than me. And this was done in 148 investigations stretching over 28 years. And it found, quote, that people who had larger networks of friends had a 50% increased chance of survival by the end of the study. And those who had good quality relationships had a 91% higher survival rate. She concluded that being unpopular increases our chance of death more strongly than obesity, physical inactivity, or binge drinking. In fact, the only comparable health hazard is smoking, unquote. Professor Prinstein noted that what was important in attaining longer and better life was not gaining status or prestige, but rather being likable. I quote again, "Likability reflects kindness, benevolent leadership, and selfless pro-social behavior. Research suggests that this form of popularity offers lifelong advantages and leads to relationships that confer the greatest health benefits," unquote. Now, of course, at the same time, in every human born, a restrictive energy arises to keep the maturing ego safe from destructive forces. The young baby learns from experience that finger is me, stove not me. And as the infant grows, the danger grows that either from painful experiences or distorted information, it will lead to seeing the ever-increasing number of egos that it encounters less as potential egos, other selves, but more as the other, the alien. Good parents and communities foster the continuous expansion of the self, the ego, to embrace. Now, I understand this is, in any case, the exact opposite the way I was brought up as a Roman Catholic in the 1930s, and Sister Mary Holycard would teach us we have to empty out ourselves. We have to diminish ourselves. I think, and I think other colleagues, that's precisely the opposite. All good parents and communities foster the continuous expansion of the self, of the ego, to embrace an ever-increasing number of alter, Latin for other, alter egos, while encouraging the restrictive energy needed for well-being, but no more. What that right balance is between the expansive, inclusive, and the restrictive energies is not always obvious. It is the responsibility of the parents, family, and community to discern and teach this balance. Some or many decisions may be faulty and hence mislead. Even the best can be mistaken at times so that imbalances result. However, a healthy child, a healthy family, a healthy community will turn these misstep experiences into means of learning the right path more securely in the future. Thus, a child will grow to maturity, to adulthood, having formed for herself in dialogue and confidently balanced the dialogic self-understanding and corresponding behavior. Growth, expansion, inclusion, of course, does not cease with adulthood. The adult person can now with greater surety launch out into the deep in search of the ultimate goal of wholeness, of holiness. The two are the same, wholeness and holiness. 2.5 millennia ago, Confucius pointed out the path, the proper way, the Tao of life. He said, and I quote, "At 15, my heart knew the mandate of heaven. At 15, my heart was set on learning. At 30, I stood firm. At 40, I had no more doubts. At 50, I knew the mandate of heaven. At 60, my ear was obedient, and at 70, I could follow my heart's desire without transgressing the norm," unquote. St. Augustine, in the 5th century CE, compressed that maturation process even more. He said, ama et fac quod vis. You love and do what you will. More modern spiritual theology writers, following the 17th century Saint Teresa of Avila and Saint John of the Cross, lay out a triad of development: the purgative way, the illuminative way, the unitive way, ultimately to embrace the transcendent, however understood. This path of development is valid whether one is a theist or not, as is reflected in Abraham Maslow's so-called pyramid of needs, which tends ultimately toward self-transcendence. He wrote, "Transcendence refers to the very highest and most inclusive or holistic levels of human consciousness, behaving and relating as ends rather than means to oneself, to significant others, to human beings in general, to other species, to nature, and to the cosmos." The theist would add, and to God. As this maturing dialogic balance is reached, the person begins to notice that others have also attained this balance, but on a different set of principles and assumptions. A healthy curiosity arises, and the person wishes to know how that is possible. Ah, yes, then begins a new adventure in life. We constantly encounter other persons, of course, on relatively superficial levels. However, as we sort out for ourselves the meaning of life and how to live according to that maturing understanding, in today's global village, we inevitably one day will encounter another person who is mature, not just superficially, but in her inner reality, who, however, bases her understanding of the ultimate meaning of life and how to live accordingly. That's the fundamental description of what religion is. Bases it on sources and images radically different from ours. This other might be of a different religion, a different culture. She will suddenly appear to us deeply other, as alien, because this is not a superficial encounter, but one which goes to the heart of another person, to her values that determine her life and her life's choices and actions. This comes to us who have perhaps only recently worked out for ourselves our own basic values and consequent rules for action. It comes as a profound shock. How can this be? How can it be that this other mature person does not understand the foundational meaning of life and its consequent rules for action the same way I have figured it out? Intriguing, unsettling. Do I investigate or turn away? If each time an opportunity presents itself in our life, we follow our restrictive energy and turn away from the other, we will necessarily remain truncated, especially in the world of the third millennium, wherein humanity has entered the age of global dialogue. If, however, we decide to follow our inborn, expansive, inclusive energy, we will reach out in dialogue, in deep dialogue, which is dialogue turned into self-transformative virtue, a structurally oriented, automatic way of seeing and acting, and consequently our life will be irrevocably changed in an increasingly open direction. John Donne described this reaching out to the other as passing over. As we come to know our new dialogue partner's inner spirit, everything at first looks strange, different, alien. But because we see it lived with integrity, we find that it appeals to us somehow, at first oddly, making up an integrated whole, a strange, new to us wholeness, holiness. We see our dialogue partner being at home in her integrated inner and outer world, and having begun to pass over to it, we too begin to feel the strangeness slowly fall away. In learning increasingly more about our dialogue partners' brave new world that has such people in it, as Shakespeare noted, we are pleased to discover old friends in many of its principles and images. But even more pleasing, and at times surprising, we come across these principles and images in totally unsuspected guises, in places we never thought to look for them before. For example, I may have learned the golden rule from Jesus, Rabbi Yeshua of Nazareth, in the gospel. And now I learn that he was already anticipated by his teacher, Rabbi Hillel. And Rabbi Hillel's version was also preceded by the 6th century BCE Torah of Israel. And that too was matched in the 6th century BCE by Confucius from China, Zarathustra from Iran, and Thales from Greece. At times I may even learn in the encounter with prominent traits of my partner's tradition that those principles and practices, in fact, were also part of my tradition, but for one reason or another they atrophied or even disappeared. And maybe it will be helpful to bring them back, perhaps in a renovated form. For example, the Muslim practice of praying 5 times a day is matched by the Christian practices of morning and evening prayers plus the Angelus at 6 a.m., noon, and 6 p.m., and Compline, the evening prayers. How best to utilize these particular spiritual customs that I just mentioned, which were developed for the fundamentally agriculture-based societies of 12,000 BC to 1850 CE, all this awaits further contemporary and future experimentation and dialogue. Though we feel increasingly more welcome in our newly found visitor's home, most often we also increasingly realize that this is not our home. Hardly ever can we replace our hometown, although a few persons may make the spiritual journey hither, never again to fully return home. Along with the exciting commonalities we find in our visitor's home, we also relearn that there are, in fact, also differences between our home and our visitor's home, although most often those differences are located at dramatically different places than we had imagined beforehand. These differences might be, 1, nominal, that is, real commonalities, but hidden under different names, nominal. 2, complementary, that is, they complete each other, as, for example, alongside the Catholic custom of imitating Jesus, the Imitazione Christi, also that of looking to saints as models could be seen as not competing, but complementing the Muslim custom of looking to Muhammad as a life model, and indeed to Sufi saints within the Sufi communities and beyond. 3, contrary. That is, two positions can be different without being mutually exclusive, as, for example, the notion of the Muslim paradise and Buddhist nirvana as the goal of life. Or 5th, the differences might be contradictory. That is, one excludes the other, as, for example, the Christian teaching of eternal life. And what that concretely means is, I would say, a mystery locked within mystery, as opposed to the atheist position that the human person totally ceases with the grave. It is wonderful to visit new places, but it is even more wonderful to return home, as John Donne urges us to pass over, to experience from within our dialogue partner's home. Then, because we are on a dialogic journey, after having passed over to our visitor's home, we then need also to pass back to our home. But we come back profoundly transformed. We can no longer think and live as if we were the center of the universe, as if our understanding of the meaning of life was the only and complete understanding. We now realize that ours is one view of the world and its meaning, that there are numberless views, each of them, including mine, being necessarily limited, being perceived through my cognitive faculties, and yours, and yours, and yours. Let me urge upon you to listen to a mantra. Aristotle, in differing from his teacher Plato, taught us that there is nothing in the intellect which was not first in the senses. Thus, for example, after perceiving with various of our senses multiple animals, we are able to discern that there is, for example, a canine species, a feline species, etc., etc. To look at an example that is more pertinent to our reflection here today, we might pose to ourselves this question: how can, for example, the Bible or the Quran or some other formative document, how can it influence our lives? At the most basic level, for example, the Bible and the Quran are multiple sheets of paper with various ink markings on them. As such, they can have no influence on our lives except perhaps to sit as decoration on a bookshelf. But then we learn that the ink markings are meaningful words written in Hebrew, Greek, or Arabic. Now, to stay just for the moment with the Bible as our further example, the Bible can have no influence on my life unless I learn to read Hebrew and Greek, or someone else who knows not only both Hebrew and Greek, but also my tongue, in this case English, and translates the Bible into English for me. Everybody who has ever translated an essay or a book knows that his or her translation is always a more or less accurate reproduction of the original document. At more times than we wish, this can very easily lead to serious misunderstandings. Let me give you a brief example of such misunderstandings. In Genesis of the Bible, Genesis chapter 2, according to the King James translation, it says, I quote, "And God took a little earth and created the man," unquote, Genesis 2:6. Now, most English readers understood that to mean that God created the male first, and that understanding was fraught with multiple dire consequences for women. This understanding, and I would today say this gross misunderstanding, had manifold negative consequences for half the population of the world, women. Already in the first epistle to Timothy, traditionally attributed to St. Paul as the author, writing in Greek followed the prior Septuagint Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which says, quote, this is the letter to Timothy, "Let the woman learn in silence with all subjection. I suffer no woman to teach or have authority over a man, but to be in silence." Now, note this, it continues. "For Adam was first formed, and then Eve," unquote. However, if one looks at the original Hebrew, it says, and I quote as closely as I can put it into English as literal as possible, quote, "God took a little earth," the Hebrew term is Adamah, "and formed," guess what? He formed Ha-Adam. Ha means the, and Adam comes from Adamah. Not the man, because the man in our English language, in our heads, means first of all the male, and then the rest of humanity, namely females. So it says God took a little earth, Adamah, and formed Ha-Adam, the male. But literally, Ha-Adam comes from Adamah, and it means not the male, but the earthling. It took from the earth, Adamah, comes Adam, the earthling. Thus, the first Hebrew translators into Greek, the Jewish scholars who produced the so-called Septuagint Greek translation, started the mischief already, for they translated Ha-Adam, the earthling, as anthropos, the human being, which term, of course, lost all connection with the earth of the Hebrew Adamah. Thus, what, first of all, the Hebrew writer of Genesis wrote, secondly, passes through the minds of the Septuagint translators, and then 3, into the understanding of the writer of the Pauline epistle to Timothy, and 4, ultimately, through the minds of the translators of the hugely influential King James translation, resulting in a massive negative impact on Christian women for at least 2,000 years. This is a single example of one of the reasons why we now have more than 450 English translations of the Bible, and still counting. Even the best possible research translation is only one particular, more or less, but never completely accurate reproduction of the original. This mental interpretation that all of us necessarily engage in, however, is by no means limited to translations of single words, such as Ha-Adam, mistranslated as the man, rather than the more accurate the earthling. Whole ideologies are at times amazingly built in grossly distorted fashion. Let me offer one example, such an interpretation of the same portion of the Bible, namely chapter 3 of Genesis. I tell my undergraduate students in the basic study of world religions course that in reading texts, we are supposed to engage in exegesis, a Greek-rooted word, meaning ex coming out of it, Jesus taking. So we're supposed to do exegesis, take out of the text what is in the text, we must avoid eisegesis. E-I-S in Greek means into. So the eisegesis is putting into the text what was in our head rather than exegesis taking it out, what's in the text. We already saw with the letter to Timothy that this painting of the woman as weak in intellect and will is the foundation of a whole ideology of the inferiority of the woman, and that the man was the strong one, but misled by the woman. But let us briefly take a look at the text and try to do an exegesis, not a traditional eisegesis. The text says that the woman took a walk in the garden of paradise, and she met a serpent. Now, this serpent was a very special creature. He was said to be the craftiest of all animals in the garden. So the two of them struck up a conversation. Now, we should note, the woman did not gossip about what she might eat for lunch or the pretty flowers or something. Rather, she engaged in a deep dialogue about truth and falsehood, life and death, good and evil, wisdom. The clever serpent told the woman that if she ate the fruit of the one tree God told her not to eat, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, she would become like God, knowing good and evil, unquote. She was intrigued. Who wouldn't be? Then the text says that the woman saw that the fruit of the tree, quote, was good for gaining wisdom, and so she ate the fruit, unquote. The very next line is also important. It says simply, quote, she gave some to her man who was with her, and he ate, period. The very next sentence, the very next scene in the text is that God is walking in the cool of the evening of the garden and calls the man who says that he is hiding because he is naked. And then God asks him, quote, did you eat of the forbidden fruit, unquote. The man bravely answers, the woman you put here with me gave me, and I ate. Put the guy in a bad position. I'm sorry. Then the story moves on toward its sad denouement with the woman and the man being driven out of paradise. Incidentally, at this point, the promise that you will be like God from the serpent, he wasn't lying, because it says here, and God, and this is Genesis 3:22, and God said, look, they, the man and the woman, have become like one of us, knowing good and evil. So the serpent did not lie about this. The woman and the man did become like God, knowing good and evil. So then I repeat the question to my students. I say, what is the image of the woman? Not in what you learn in one place or another, but in the text. Typically, they respond, well, the woman was obviously a serious thinker, for she engaged the quote-unquote cleverest of the animals, unquote, not in a light-headed conversation, but about questions of truth and falsehood, good and evil, life and death, wisdom. This is not me making it up. That's what the text is all about. Then she looked and saw that, quote, the fruit was good for wisdom, unquote. And then she made an executive decision, quote, she took and ate, unquote. In the image of the man in the text, I ask, they note what the text says, that he was there, unquote, but he did not engage in the profound dialogue about truth and falsehood, good and evil, life and death, wisdom, or being like God. The text simply says, quote, she gave some fruit to her man and he ate, period. Now the male students usually smile somewhat sheepishly at this point, and even more so when they note that he bravely answered God why he ate the forbidden fruit, quote, the woman gave it to me and I ate. That's direct quote. Thus, if one simply looks at the text and doesn't read into it what is not there but has been drilled into the heads of Christian followers for 2 millennia, one would have to say with all honesty that the text presents the woman as a deeply thoughtful person who deliberately weighs in on the most profound of subjects, looks at the evidence, makes an executive decision, and acts on it. What is the image of the man as the text presents it? Not as millions of readers or listeners have been told to see him. Well, the text says that the man was present, but it does not portray him as engaging in a profound conversation. It just says he was present. And it doesn't say that he acted on this. No, it simply says she gave him some fruit and he ate. The image of the man in the text, not in your head, but in the text, is quite literally, quote, I would say, a silent stomach. It does not improve in the next scene, for in the text, when asked by God, as I noted before, whether he ate the forbidden fruit, he says, the woman who was with me gave me some and I ate. That's the image of the man in the text, not in the head of somebody who told you was there. Now, you might be willing to say at this point, it's an interesting, perhaps even an eye-opening analysis of an ancient folk tale. But what does it matter? Well, imagine if an analysis anything like what I have presented here in only the briefest of all fashion were in fact the standard picture of the first woman in the formative decades and centuries of Christian history, how different the lives of Christian women and men would have been in the last 2,000 years. Finally, such analyses are fortunately increasingly spreading in the Christian world now, and belatedly are beginning to make a profound difference. This nature of all Bible translations and all too often eisegesis interpretations is in fact true not only of biblical texts but of all knowledge. All knowledge is my knowing, your knowing, their knowing. Are we each then consequently trapped in our individual perceptions and articulations of reality? Some of us, too many of us, unfortunately, are so trapped. What we need to do is to share our perceptions and understandings with each other by way of dialogue, by deep dialogue, which is self-transformative, to advance together toward an ever fuller, ever more accurate grasp of reality. However, perfect, full knowledge is like the horizon. We can continually progress toward it, but we never reach it. I said 2 mantras. Here's the second, much more briefly, that I would like to share with you. This is, nobody knows everything about anything, therefore dialogue. Now, after all, if that's true, nobody knows everything about anything, therefore dialogue, what physicist, for example, would get up in the morning and say, she doesn't need to go to the laboratory anymore, she knows everything about physics? Or what sociologist would wake up and say, she doesn't need to do any more research, she knows all about how human groups interact. Or what chemist or economist or, including what religious thinker or of whatever functions as religion in a person's life would get up in the morning and say, I don't need to learn anything more about religion or its equivalent. I already know everything. Keep in mind, religion is, quote, an explanation of the ultimate, the total meaning of life and how to live according to that explanation, based on some notion of the transcendent, however understood. If we cannot know everything about any part of human life, the biological, sociological, physiological, psychological, how much more can we not know everything about its total meaning, which religion, of course, purports to know? The whole point of a mantra, oftentimes in 17 syllables, is that it encapsulates some deep insight in penetrating, easily remembered language. So, look around this room. Let me invite you to learn this mantra that we just talked about so that you can later muse about it, turn it over in your mind, feel it, taste it, see what it might do for you, to you. So, I'm going to take a risk. I'm going to say this mantra again, then I'm going to invite you all to say it after me. Who knows what will happen? So it goes like this. Nobody knows everything about anything, therefore dialogue. We try it? Nobody knows everything about anything, therefore dialogue. Congratulate yourselves. From our experiencing of other worldviews and other ways of living in the world, we now find that we must also engage in intense dialogue with members of our home tradition, sharing with them the fruits of our encounter with our dialogue partner. We must serve as a bridge between the two, our home and our new home. Perhaps at times, somewhat painfully, we learn what the nature of a bridge is. It gets stepped on. As our dialogic experiences continue in life, we find ourselves increasingly at home in more and more traditions, although our hometown remains our most at ease home. However, our home is utterly transformed from a rigid, self-contented, closed place to a home for all. It is nevertheless still anchored in its own traditions, but they are growing traditions that embrace and adapt the new, the other, into a transformed and transforming, integrated whole that wondrously, constantly recreates itself into a holiness. That is, as we noted before, like the horizon which we constantly reach for, and in fact do move toward, but never reach. These two mantras express succinctly the prolegomena, the necessary preparation for dialogue, particularly interreligious, intercultural dialogue. As a consequence, our dialogue with ourselves and with others has, especially since the 18th century Enlightenment, become increasingly not only possible, but necessary. Now, in the 21st century, as we have moved into the age of global dialogue, it is absolutely vital that we engage in this dialogue. What does this word dialogue, as it is used today, mean? Although the word dialogue is made up of two Greek parts, logos, which first of all, of course, means thinking, like logic, and then secondly, the usual way we communicate our thinking, words. Dia means across or together. Hence, dialogue linguistically means thinking and talking together. However, dialogue really is much broader, deeper, pervasive than that linguistic meaning. Dialogue, at its most fundamental sense, can be described as a, quote, mutual interchange of values. And in this fundamental sense, dialogue is at the very heart of the universe, of which we humans are the highest expression. From the macro level, the interaction, the dialogue of matter and energy in the cosmos of billions of galaxies, each with billions of stars, ever expanding since the Big Bang 13 billion years ago, succinctly expressed in Einstein's deathless formula, E equals mc squared, energy equals mass times the square of the speed of light. To the micro level, the interaction of protons and electrons in every atom, and today we're going down to gluons and Lord knows how much deeper, to the symbiosis of body and spirit in every human being, the dialogue between body and spirit, between men and women, between individual and community. We cannot become human persons except in dialogue in the community. The very essence of the entire universe, peaking in our humanity then, is dialogic. Hence, a fulfilled dialogic human life is the highest expression of the cosmic dance of dialogue. And we humans are the lead dancers in this cosmic dance of dialogue. There are 4 dimensions, at least, of dialogue. Dialogue of the head, dialogue of the hands, dialogue of the heart, and dialogue of the whole, or the holy. In the dialogue of the head, we together seek the truth. In dialogue of the hands, we together seek the good. That is, to heal the world around us, tikkun olam, as the ancient Hebrew tradition states it. And in the dialogue of the heart, we experience and embrace the other in their expressions of beauty, in art, architecture, music, poetry, dance. And here, too, is where the depth, the spiritual, mystical dimension of the human spirit is given its full reign. As the 17th century mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal said, le cœur a ses raisons que la raison ne connaît point. The heart has its reasons which reason alone knows. It does not know. Finally, in the dialogue of the holy, we share each other's spirituality in our striving for an integrated wholeness. Remember, wholeness, holy, all comes from the Greek holos, to mean be whole. Holiness doesn't mean run around with your hands placed together and saying things and wearing certain clothes and not doing some things. Holiness is being a whole, integrated person. The natural direction of the newborn, as we noted at the beginning of our reflections, is to reach from ego, this means I in Latin, the self, to the other, to move outward in order to draw inward, perhaps in the first instance to bring the mother's breast to mouth. The infant naturally reaches out for the good, to draw it to itself, its ego. As the infant learns to recognize other egos, mother, father, siblings, friends, neighbors, a natural expansive energy comes into play, expanding its ego to include ever more alter, Latin for other, alter egos. And so in English we say of our best friend that she is our alter ego, our other self, for whom, in extremis, we would even give up the life of our primus, our first ego, for our alter ego. Just as Jesus said, quote, "Greater love than this hath no one, but that she give up her life for her friend," unquote. The final goal of human life can be described in many ways. In my judgment, for my 90 years to date, one of the best ways can be summarized in a single word, holiness. Healthy, whole, integrated. Most traditional religions place their ultimate focus after the grave. But even this traditional goal really focuses on this side of the grave, for all such religions insist that how we live on this side of the grave determines what happens, what we hope will happen beyond the grave. The important focus necessarily is on the now. Carpe diem. In my high school learned Latin, seize the day, live now. Very Buddhist among other traditions. What does this holiness mean in practical terms? I have argued that it means following our built-in initial human thrust, our expansive, inclusive energy, and continuing to expand our ego endlessly, seeking tirelessly ever more being in all forms, preeminently, but by no means exclusively, the human person. If one sees the grave as the end of the human person, then the ultimate goal of human life is most of all the good of all of human persons, but also in proportionate ways of being. If one leans toward theism, then the ultimate goal is the trans person, God, perhaps, as I indicated, best named mystery, and her self-expansion, creation, which we see today as stemming from the so-called Big Bang. We have a term for that expansive action, whether theist or non-theist, love. That is the expansive, inclusive move to become one with the true, the good, the beautiful, with being, remembering that the natural thrust of love is non-restrictive and potentially embraces, includes all, endlessly. Let me end with what the penetrating seer of the New Testament, St. John, wrote to his beloved community. Ho theos agape estin. God is love. Thank you.